Everybody listen to We're Not Wizards, because we are the best, and we're not wizards, no matter what anybody says. Goodbye.
Welcome to another episode of We're Not Wizards. My name's Richard. I'll be your host for May, because the summer's approaching. You know, it's kind of, do you remember what you did last summer? Do you remember what you did several summers ago? Do you remember what you did a couple of 100 years ago? Well, if you're struggling, I've maybe got a guest who can help us look into the past. That person is Holly Nielsen. And Holly Nielsen is a historian. That's an official title, by the way. and Holly's on to talk about they've done a lot of work in the history of board games. So we're going to have a little chat about that, as well as finding out a little bit about their good selves. And hopefully you shall walk away from this podcast edumacated, as they would say.
Oh no,
so
that's a lot of pressure.
It's not. It's kind of, it could be. It depends. Anyway, how are you doing? Are you well?
Yeah, I'm alright. How are you?
Yeah, it's been quite sunny. I've kind of picked the wrong day to be inside, I guess, at night time, and have to kind of keep the windows closed so the passing traffic doesn't kind of affect any of the kind of the recording things. So that's not a good thing. You know, that's not a good thing. What about yourself? How are you?
I'm good. I mean, I spend most of my time indoors reading books or in a library, so I spend most of my time looking out into the weather and being like, oh, okay, yeah, probably should be outside at some point, but nah.
I mean, I've obviously floated the idea that you're a board game historian. You're probably saying that has set the bar far too high. I have been involved in it, but you're not kind of expecting some kind of Indiana Jones kind of archaeologist, kind of historian type thing. You don't have a bullwhip, I'm guessing, or a fedora.
No, that happens after the PhD. That's, you get your degree and then you get the hat and the whip and it's all very official.
You get sent to like Chile or Peru to get some kind of golden meeple or something. Is that kind of what happens?
Yeah. Something like that. I mean, I joke a bit about, I was like, well, the amount of time I've spent looking at old board games and I've yet to come across like a Jumanji situation. Yeah. And then my friends will point out, it's like, well, you spend most of your time looking at like really problematic games from like the 19th century. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think I want to be like drawn into that kind of horrible imperial Victorian world. But, maybe one day.
No. Are you quite a keen kind of board gamer yourself? I mean, do you manage to get, obviously doing what you do, I mean, it must take up an awful lot of time. I guess after kind of like a hard day where you've been looking through kind of stuff, you're kind of like the last thing you want to do is actually to look at another board game. But are you quite a regular kind of player of games yourself?
Yeah, so me and the people I live with in my flat, we're quite into playing board games, particularly my brother, who's one of the people I live with. He got well into board games. I think he was really into Warhammer and so got into kind of tabletop stuff through that. And through him, he's kind of introduced me to a bunch of games that we now play pretty regularly.
All right.
It's now a thing where if people are coming around, we usually have like a board game evening at our house and stuff. But then I usually get the thing where people are like, oh, but you have a master's degree in board games, or are you doing a PhD in board games? Are you going to be really good at this? And I'm like, no. Like as much as I wish like I was just starting a PhD and
I would have thought they would have done some kind of practical kind of thing on it, that you would have had to kind of like the practical exam would have been, you would have had to have been good at board games in order to continue doing kind of like the PhD. Did you not have to kind of do that then? No.
Yeah, just just write hundreds of words on Monopoly strategy, and that's pretty much, that's pretty much it, really.
I can imagine that could be actually punishment for some people, having to sit down and spend, like, all the good people have done well in their PhD stuff so far. You can go and sit in that room and you can write about all the nice games, and you over there, you can write about tactics for frustration, and also for Ludo, and you can also Twister as well. Oh, not Twister, kind of thing, and so on and so forth. Do you remember what's your history been like with kind of like board games? What was the kind of the first games that you remember kind of playing?
So, as a family, I remember board games being a thing I always wanted to play, but rarely were my parents kind of like not working late hours, or not about enough to play with me. So it's always a thing of I always wanted to play, and rarely when we got the occasion to, I was always like, yeah, but actually we didn't play that much. I remember kind of having a Disney Trivial Pursuit that I used to make people play because I knew it was the only way I'd ever win a game of Trivial Pursuit.
What were the questions?
Kind of things.
Does that mean that your Disney kind of trivia is right up there? That potentially, if your paths had gone another way, you might have been doing a PhD in Disneyology or something like that instead.
So so the path that I chose not to take, I looked at the board game and I looked at the Disney aspect and I was like, well, there's only one of these I can choose. But yeah, so, and I just remember playing a lot of those kind of really plasticky, physical, kind of like Mousetrap and things like that, which I'd often just, kind of play by myself, set them up and just fiddle about with them, but I don't really count. It wasn't really playing like you'd play a kind of normal board game. But yeah, so that was it really. And then I didn't actually, a lot of people kind of think like, oh, well, if you're kind of studying these things, you must have been well into them as a kid. And not really. It was something I always wanted to do, but never really did. So maybe this is my way of making up for it now by just, filling all my spare time looking at these things. But yeah.
You always had an interest in kind of like history. Because I guess so people who aren't aware of kind of a bit of your background, you're not just a historian, you're a writer, and you have done quite a lot of writing in the kind of the video game kind of field. So were video games kind of like another area that you kind of found yourself kind of getting interested in as well? Did the two kind of come hand in hand, or was it kind of like video games first before it was kind of like board games?
So I'd say it was probably video games first, because I used to play video games quite a bit as a kid. And kind of got into games journalism when I was doing my undergraduate degree. And just wrote about video games and kind of came across board games as a topic almost by accident, really, because my undergraduate and what I did my undergraduate dissertation on were absolutely nothing to do with board games. I didn't even do modern history. Right. I did early modern history, and I wrote my dissertation on I'm trying to remember it now. It was Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton in their alchemical and magical research.
Oh, right, okay.
So my kind of special topic was I was interested in ritual and kind of spheres of ritual and things like that. And then I remember going into the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton for a totally different reason. I was there with a bunch of people from my course, and one of the things that was brought out was a board game made by a Black and Asian women's group in the 1970s, I think, in East London. All right. And it was a homemade Snakes and Ladders board. But the point of the game was that you always lost because you were playing as a Black woman in society at that time. And it was this kind of dark humor kind of, and I just thought it was just so powerful and so interesting. And it was also at a time when in video games, kind of Gamergate was happening, and there was all these ideas of games being political and being progressive, and a lot of fight. And as a historian, and as well anybody who kind of looks at the humanities know, that everything is political in its own way. And it was kind of really infuriating seeing this. And I like this idea of kind of taking games into this longer narrative that goes because I think video games are often kind of treated in this kind of little digital bubble.
Yeah.
And actually there's this much longer history of kind of rule-based structured play that goes into into board games. And so, yeah, just kind of those kind of two things. And then also looking at ritual, which is a lot of the kind of theory around ritual is very similar to theories around play. So they're all kind of like merged together. And then I started doing a bit of reading, and then I realized like, oh my God, there's like barely anything, there's very little written on board games, particularly like social and cultural history. And that very rarely happens in history. Usually you think of a topic and then you'll go and there'll be this like, hundreds of books written about it. And so, yeah, it was a big shock to see that actually there wasn't much there, which is good, but also incredibly intimidating, because suddenly you don't have, Professor so-and-so, you can follow their thesis. You have to suddenly think on your feet a bit more, which is, I think, a challenge that I've enjoyed quite a bit.
Is it maybe because, say with board games, I mean, anyone can effectively make up a board game. I speak to people all the time running kind of like Kickstarter campaigns for their own board game, and they have taken essentially kind of little tokens, chitties, kind of like pieces of paper, stuff like that, in order to create their own kind of game. Do you reckon that because of that, maybe that the board games aren't, the smaller kind of maybe less well-known games aren't as well documented, or there wasn't seen as a need to document it, because of potentially it was just this form of entertainment. It was potentially, hey, look what I've invented. And maybe people didn't think at the time, oh, you better box that up and write that down, because there'll be a historian in the future who's wanting to write kind of all about it.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an issue with kind of what gets put in an archive and what doesn't. And so there's a couple of, so the Museum of Childhood in London has quite a big board game collection, but it's actually when we kind of get these old board games now, it's mainly through donations of private collectors, because museums for a long time were like, well, it's, it's not worth keeping these things. They're just these items of play. They're, leisure. They're not, important, quote unquote important things. And yeah, so you get kind of these private collectors who, over the decades, or, some of them going to century, have like collated these huge, this huge amount of board games. And they're now kind of slowly being kind of donated to these museums and archives, and so are then available to historians and to researchers. And so I think, there's kind of, I think the Bodleian has this huge collection now, which it got over the last few years. And so like all of a sudden there's this huge amount of material. But it's still a bit kind of disparate. It's still a bit kind of all over the place. Like when the archives I use are like a little bit of everything, other than the kind of Bodleian and the Museum of Childhood. There's the Imperial War Museum has some First World War games, and then the Museum of London has some suffragette games, and they're kind of dotted all over the place, which makes it a bit more challenging, because you don't really have this central hub. But it's hopefully with kind of more readily available archives, more people will become interested in them. But it's a difficult thing, because I think a lot of history departments especially can still be a little bit kind of ironically stuck in the past with how they approach history. And
I can't believe you went there.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
No.
But it's a difficult thing, but I think more and more there's becoming a bit more awareness of it, and it's taken a little bit more seriously, and there's some brilliant historians who have like done very good work on it. So it's kind of gradually building up into this bigger thing, but it's exciting to see it happen.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing recently with the discussion over the kind of the archiving and the collection of kind of like video games, and the kind of basically that video games have a shelf life to the point where they might not necessarily work anymore, and that due to kind of like copyright issues and availability, you just can't get hold of any video games unless you're kind of getting them kind of nudge nudge wink wink kind of illegally off of kind of like ROM kind of places, which is kind of, it's almost like, we're talking about documenting history, but 1980s when a lot of video games started off, that's a good that's a good while ago now, and we're losing a lot of stuff because of IP kind of protection and stuff like that, which is kind of like a kind of like a strange thing. How old are board games? I mean, that is the biggest question. But, people kind of go, I mean, we talked kind of a little bit in the green room quickly to say, well, Catan is what, Monopoly is what people kind of think about. But, do they go back as far as people say? Are there people in Pompeii that were playing little board games? Or does it even go further back? Did Ugg pick up a stone as a Cro-Magnon man and put it right in front of Tharg's stone and went, I win, and then hit him over the head with his club? I mean, is that kind of as far back as we went? I
mean, I can't guarantee about Ugg playing. I'm afraid I can't verify that. But there are ancient board games. There's like the game of which was played in Mesopotamia, and there's Egyptian board games. And so they've been around for thousands of years. If you think a board game is actually, it can be, if you kind of broaden your idea of what a board game is and what a board can be, just kind of drawing in the dirt can be a board game. Carving into stone and things like that happens quite a bit. I'm afraid I'm not as sharp on ancient board games because my own topic is Britain, and Britain was a bit of a latecomer to the board game scene as far as we can tell. Yeah. But no, they've been around for thousands of years. But they're very difficult sources to analyze, really, because especially with these ancient board games, you don't have the rules written out a lot of the time. You just have the board and you have these symbols, and play is this really, really tricky thing to analyze. There's a thing about board games where some historians will call them mute sources, in that if you look at the board game, it doesn't tell you anything really about the actual play that took place. It doesn't tell you who played it, why they played it, how they played it necessarily, because people like to, change and push against rules and things like that. So it all gets very complicated, which is why for my own research, when I did my my master's, my MPhil, I did a kind of social and cultural history, but I did a lot of kind of analysing the board games from the perspective of understanding the developers and the people who published them. And then for my PhD, I'm hoping to actually try and, how do we talk about players and how do we use board games to understand players and the role they played in people's lives, which is it's a tricky thing. And when I think to my topic, I only go back to the kind of 19th century, late 18th century sometimes, and even then I'm kind of scratching my head and figuring out, well, how do I talk about the people who played them? And then I think of these archaeologists who are studying the game of and these thousands, and I'm like, okay, right, I have it pretty easy in comparison. I shouldn't complain.
Got it. But I mean, what kind of games, if you were, if I was walking into kind of like, no, because I'm actually trying to swagger, but I shouldn't do that. If I was walking in quite prim and proper, and we'd had a lovely dinner, we'd had some cigars and some brandy, and then somebody said, shall we play a board game? What kind of board games were you looking at? Kind of like, late 1800s, early 1900s. What could I expect to play? And first, and I guess secondly, were they any good or were they just rubbish?
I mean, it's so a lot of the board games I look at are games designed for children,
right?
So I spend a lot of I've looked at more Ludo and Snakes and Ladders boards than anybody should ever look at in their life. I've seen so many. So those games, as we know, they're like entirely chance-based games. So they're not that interesting by our by our standards, but they're still popular today. People still play them, especially younger children. Yeah. But then I guess, you have chess and things like that, which are huge. In the kind of 19th century, you get the first chess celebrities appearing. Really? And it was treated like a proper sport. It was, kind of sport columns and newspapers had a chess section. It was taken very seriously, and it was and you get these celebrities popping up, and it's a really interesting, the whole culture around chess is really fascinating. So that's a big one. And then I guess you get things like whist, and not necessarily board games, but whist and mahjong and things like that. But yeah, so there's a real plethora of games out there, and and also just who you were, I think, had a real impact on what games you played and the situations you played them in. So a lot of so if the kind of middle class was defining itself in the late kind of 18th and mainly in the 19th century, this kind of new British middle class was kind of, you know, saying, oh no, we're different from the upper class and we're different from the lower class. We're this, you know, we're all of this. And I think one of the ways they did that was by defining their play as being different. So they made a big deal of not being gamblers. You know, the middle class were kind of one of the things that defined them was religious sensibilities. And so play had to be different from gambling. So you get these amazing, it's on there's an exhibition on at the British Museum at the moment, which is all about playing with money. So I'd highly recommend that.
Yeah. Okay.
And in that they have these, I think they're whist tokens, and on them there's like these kind of little kind of sayings, be like, oh, you know, we don't gamble and things like that, and oh, play virtuously, and, you know, like really define themselves as, you know, we're playing this game, but no, it's not gambling. It's all about improvement, and it's all about all these things, and it's just a way of defining themselves as being different and a different way of playing. And so, yeah,
was
that
there an
goes
influence?
On into the 20th century.
Was there an influence in made up board games, like to do with kind of like religious virtue and stuff like that? I mean, did you see that, and did you also see maybe influences from other countries as, you know, immigration increased into the UK? Did you kind of notice that in the type of? I mean, you mentioned the kind of the Snakes and Ladders board game. Was there kind of similar kind of board games of that ilk that had kind of that were almost kind of influenced from external forces kind of outside the UK?
So there's a big connection between Empire and the British Empire and board games.
Right.
So both Snakes and Ladders and Ludo, which were probably two of the most popular board games around kind of turn of the century, Edwardian, early 20th century. Both of those are, so Snakes and Ladders originally comes from Gyanshapur. I'm probably saying that wrong. But it was it's a game from Asia, kind of India, Tibetan, all that kind of region, and it was a spiritual game. It was a game not necessarily played in the same way that we would think of it. It's a game about kind of reincarnation and gaining higher spiritual levels and things like that. So the fate in Snakes and Ladders was all about this kind of karmic cycle. And then it kind of got brought over to Britain with returning colonial families and with people who were stationed in India. And first of all, it was brought over as this kind of anthropological curiosity. There's a lot of things to do with that when people are writing about it. But then it gets rebranded at the end of the 19th century as this game for kids, as a way for kids to learn. In fact, I think actually the first one it was a round board, and it was produced by F.H. Ayers. And I don't actually know, I can't remember the top of my head, but I don't think that one necessarily had the kind of moral education element of it. But definitely it became this game of kind of teaching morals to children, but it has this really weird kind of history, really, because it's about kind of, so it kind of, in some ways at this time you get a lot of these kind of like Orientalist motifs in these games. You know, you have kind of snake charmers and all these kind of tropes that were used in advertising, and people would have recognized it was a way of kind of defining the other and making it exotic, and, you know, this kind of nondescript, slightly not slightly but racist kind of portrayals of India and places like that. And Snakes and Ladders, it loses that gradually, and because it kind of gets known as this kind of British game, and it's a British game about, you know, educating children. And Ludo has a much sharper kind of cutoff, because Ludo's from Pachisi, which is an Indian game. Yeah. And then the kind of who branded Ludo first is a very complicated, there's like a whole bunch of things going on, but basically it comes over someone, you know, it all gets rebranded as Ludo. It becomes a lot simpler to the original game Pachisi, and by kind of the turn of the century, every board game publisher has like a copy of Ludo. And it gets to the point where there's kind of all these advertisements saying, oh, this is the kind of, you know, the grand, great old British game of Ludo, and also we have the new exotic game of Pachisi, even though Pachisi is much older than Ludo, but it just lost it kind of, you know, this kind of Asian game design had just been totally co-opted by Britain, and, you know, and just all of its kind of original connections just lost at that point. It was just, by the time when it was rebranded as Ludo, it just lost the Pachisi connection totally.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been down to, we can't have a popular board game being invented outside the UK. I mean, that would have been, patriotism and stuff like that kind of coming in.
Yeah, it's such a weird thing, because then you also get games like Mahjong, which became huge in the 1920s. Like, there was this big kind of Mahjong craze.
Yeah.
And a part of that was this idea of kind of having this authentic play. So when people were talking about it, they'd be like, oh, well, I learned this from someone in Hong Kong. And there's this idea of kind of it being an authentic kind of, it's this kind of exoticization of play and these things. But I think there's also, but when it becomes connected to children and childhood, it becomes a little bit more complicated.
Uh-huh.
And so, but yeah, there's a lot going on. That's why board games are such a brilliant source, because they show this tension between kind of, they're very like domestic items at this time. Games like Ludo and Snakes and Ladders, they show this tension between domesticity and empire and teaching children and all these complicated things floating around.
You mentioned earlier on talked about kind of colonialism and its kind of like strong themes. I mean, in terms of mechanics, I mean, we talk about mechanics all the time, and mechanics just seem to be becoming kind of more complex. There's still the elegance there, but you still get the complexity of a game where you've got lots of kind of many moving parts. I mean, is there examples of games with that level of kind of complexity, kind of looking back on the stuff that you've looked at?
Yeah, so there are some games which are very complex, and it's in my own research, the ones that I've come across, they've tended to be military strategy games. So kind of games, about controlling armies and, the kind of usual stuff that we see now, really. And they can get quite complicated. There was often they would have two sets of rules. They'd have like the simple rules, and then they'd have the kind of, hardcore rules, which I remember once there was a game that I look at, that's a First World War strategy game. And I was kind of sat down, and the map is just the playing board is a map, and it's just incredibly intimidating. And I was trying to read the rules, and I was just like, oh God, why can't it just be Snakes and Ladders again? I know where I stand with Snakes and Ladders.
Did you get kind of like the themes of colonialism in some of these games there? Was it all very kind of, you're taking over the, this beautiful land and making it British and stuff like that? Was there kind of like hints of that? Or did it get kind of like, because you mentioned that some things could be problematic, to say the least? Yeah,
so vast majority of games I look at are problematic in some way or another, as is that's what happens when you look at old things generally. So you get a lot of some of the first kind of board games designed for children and for education were created in the late 18th century, and the first ones were geographical games. So they were games about teaching geography and kind of traveling the globe and basically, map makers or publishers that would have these maps. You could like throw on a couple of like numbers, a general route, and it was a board game, and you could probably sell it for a little bit more. And so a few publishers did this, and you get a lot of geographical games, a lot of kind of games about teaching geography, and then you start to get a lot of games about traveling, it's called like Traveling the Colonies, or, the Great Game of, Empire, all these things which are about teaching children about the empire and the places within the empire.
Yeah.
And yes, I've just written a chapter on them, so they're all very fresh in my head.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time, one of the things I would argue is that they're kind of teaching, well, on the surface, they're meant to be teaching kids about, places like India and things like that. But actually, I think a lot of what they're actually doing is trying to instill an idea of a British identity in kids by pointing out the other. So kind of, it's ostensibly about traveling India, but what it's really doing is trying to show a British identity by showing everything that a British identity isn't, which is which is a lot of what's going on in literature at this time as well. So there's quite a few games like that where it's you have these kind of really thick rule books, and they'll have all these descriptions of places and peoples, and it gets incredibly problematic. It gets incredibly, as you might imagine, just very, very racist, very kind of, yeah. But it's there, and it's a really big part of the history.
Is there a part? I mean, were they moving into kind of like different themes as well? Did you get? I mean, obviously, and I mean nowadays, I've seen games based on kind of like everything from, butterflies to kind of having a mariachi band to kind of like collecting ducks to fighting other squirrels for nuts and stuff like that. So there was there kind of like a wide range of those types of games probably exist as well. You can just pick a theme nowadays, and there's no doubt somebody's made a game about them. But was there that kind of wide range of themes kind of going back, or is that something that's kind of relatively new as people look for a commercial difference to sell their particular game?
There's quite a few different themes, but I mean, probably not in the same way as there is now with all those kind of things like that. There's kind of a lot of these games, they would refer to kind of stuff that was going on in society at the time to try and sell board games. So you'd get games about like the suffragettes, or games about political things that were happening and social movements and things like that, to try and cash in on this kind of a kind of quick kind of turnaround thing. So you get kind of games about that, and then I guess you get games about kind of Peter Rabbit, or you get kind of fantasy games or fairy tale games, but probably less abstract than a lot of games we have now.
Yeah. Was it more a case of taking a kind of a classic mechanic and then kind of putting the kind of the soup du jour over the top of it and saying, right, there you go, there's your suffragette movement, or,
Yeah.
Here you go, here
definitely.
Here's another topic that we've covered. Here's another one here. Get these out, because these will be selling like kind of like hotcakes today, kind of thing.
So there's a lot of that. Like most of the games I look at are race games, like really simple. You have like a board and you roll a dice or you spin a top or whichever, you move, and then there's like hindrances and there's benefits to certain spaces, like super simple. And often they would just kind of a theme was just thrown on top of it, mechanics not changing really to reflect the theme, and the theme was just kind of put on top. So it was a way of kind of getting a quick turnover, and also it was a way of you didn't have to explain your game because everyone looking at it would know how to play it, and so it wouldn't be this big intimidating thing that would need a big rule book. It could just, everyone would know how to approach it.
Is there, in terms of kind of like the modern kind of stuff, is that something that you would look at as kind of time goes on? Would you kind of drift into kind of like board games and kind of like round about the time of like Second World War and onwards? Have you kind of jumped into that area at all?
So for my MPhil research, my dates were kind of circa 1880 to 1930.
Yeah.
But for my PhD, at least at the moment, I'm sure it'll change vastly as they always do. It's the dates I'm looking around are around 1860 to 1960.
Oh, right. Okay.
So moving a little bit further, making it a little bit more modern, because there's a whole bunch of reasons, but one of the main ones is I'm really interested in players themselves, and I want to do some oral history kind of interviews. I want to talk to people who played games as kids, and so moving your period a bit further in, I'm more likely to find people who played games in the 40s, 50s, early 60s than I am in the 1880s. Exactly. So makes it a little bit easier.
Picking this time period because there's less dead people, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
What kind of, have you already started to kind of look around at kind of like the games that were kind of available at that time? Is this where you start to slightly head towards the kind of the more commercial stuff once you hit into kind of like the 60s kind of thing, or have you kind of not looked that far yet?
Games get kind of super commercial like quite early on, so kind of when printing becomes easier and cheaper, kind of in the late 19th century, then, you know, there's this kind of, there's loads of games. So they kind of, it's, and also after the First World War, there's this big boom because Germany was the leader before that in toys and games. And then after the First World War, a lot of games companies got a big boost because it was earmarked by Britain as an area where Britain could thrive in the absence of German competition. So they got a lot of investment through that.
Yeah.
And America makes a lot of board games at this time, and it becomes this big commercial. It's big business, essentially. You know, there's a lot of money to be made in board games at this time. So it's kind of a gradual thing, really. But I'm interested to see, as I'm very new to the 50s and 60s. It's only something I've just started looking at. So I'm interested to see what happens there. So I might, give me another couple of years and I'll give you a good answer.
Is there like a dark ages of board gaming where there's just like nothing? Like, you know, in the subject, it's just like there's nothing at all to look at. The board game coverage is kind of like gone and we don't know what's kind of going on. Is there any particular areas that you've found quite difficult to kind of track down the more kind of unusual games of the day?
So there's definitely archival gaps. Where there probably was stuff going on, but getting access to that stuff is incredibly difficult. I don't know why, but I found the kind of 1870 to 1880 quite difficult. I don't know why it is. It's probably just the archives I've been looking at. That's just a personal thing. I'm not saying that there was this kind of great kind of lack of board games at that time, but just personally kind of noticing where the kind of peaks are in my own, the ones I've looked at. But I think it's difficult, especially if you're looking kind of early modern, which is kind of 18th century going back to 15th, kind of that kind of time. It gets a bit difficult because then, generally the older things are, there's less around of it, particularly things like games where they're these quite disposable things sometimes, or they're seen as not worth keeping. And so it becomes very difficult to look then. But you do still get these amazing kind of like tables which were carved with games and paintings and things like that reference them. But there's definitely times where I'll be looking at my sources and I'm like, okay, I've only got 1 or 2 games for 1880, but I've got, 150 for 1900. So I need to kind of try and pad that out a bit.
What about kind of modern times? Because we seem to be in an age where there's like thousands of games kind of getting released. Do you think that we should be making conscious steps to try and catalogue as many games? I mean, Board Game Geek obviously does a good job of cataloguing a lot of games, but it depends if the person who maybe creates it or somebody actually gets, actually goes ahead and makes the effort to kind of catalogue that game as well. Do you think that maybe we need to be looking at something like that? I mean, is there things that people should maybe be doing if they want to keep a good, decent catalogue of the kind of the board gaming hobby as it kind of rolls out just now?
I think, there are probably museums and archives that have initiatives. I think there's the Strong Museum in America. I think that catalogues a lot of stuff. But obviously as a historian, I'm always like, keep it all, sure, why not? Obviously, that's a very difficult thing to do and ask of people. The practicalities of that are quite difficult. But I think a really important thing for me as well is that we don't just make an effort to keep the board games themselves, although that's obviously a really important thing. But ideas of kind of documenting the actual play itself, kind of writing about play, writing about experiences, having these moments recorded in some way, having people's reactions to games recorded, because that's a really difficult thing to capture unless there's a kind of a real effort about it. So that's one thing that I think that's really, and also a thing that I think is really important that a lot of museums and archives don't do is capturing board games that have been drawn on, board games that have been kind of written on, and all of that. For me, that is the most exciting thing I can find in an archive, is an old board game where people have drawn on it, because that's an example of a kind of player interaction that if they hadn't have done that, like physically mark the board, I could never have got access to otherwise. And so, but because a lot of archives and museums, their priority is to get really, pristine examples of games, that these kind of games are often lost. They're often thrown away, or they're kind of left in people's attics and things like that. And actually, that's incredibly valuable, and that's really important. How we go about actually collecting those things, I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah.
Maybe I think there has to be a way, even if it's not the physical things, but there's some kind of archive where if you could take pictures or record memories, things like that, then yes, that would make it a lot easier for future historians.
Yeah, because I think at the moment the board game kind of media it concentrates on kind of like, it does concentrate on previews, it concentrates on like reviews as well. There are playthroughs, but you get very kind of, yeah, you're right, you get kind of very few kind of let's just see how this unrolls. We've got it on the table, let's play it, let's see how people react. It's a very, I guess, because it comes down to people kind of giving measured opinions on how they feel about games sometimes, and sometimes they go right into the experience, and other times they're just saying, well, here's the rules, and this is kind of what I thought about it. And I guess we're not thinking about it at the time to say, how is somebody in 50 years going to be looking back on this and, try to find out more about the game? Is why was Catan so popular? Why did everybody think Magic the Gathering was fantastic, kind of thing? And it's like, well, if you look at the cards, you can see, from a skill point of view and from building decks, how skillful you must have been. But I guess, are you going to see here's an actual tournament kind of unrolling and us filming the players and how their reactions are and the kind of the stress they're going through, or how jubilant they are, or the general feel of the room and stuff like that, which is, I think, is maybe needing captured more. I don't know.
Yeah, stuff like that is just, it's so important. And I think there's also an element of, it's also a really personal thing, right? So if you're kind of, a lot of the time when I use kind of oral history sources and things like that, when people have been interviewed and asked about things, when people talk about board games, they generally talk about people. They'll say, oh, I played this game and I played it with so-and-so and, we really enjoyed it. Or I played it with my brother when, my dad wasn't there. There's all these kind of, it's all about these personal relationships. And actually, if you're asking people these things, it can get quite personal quite quickly, and that's one thing I try and talk about in my research, is the idea that play isn't always good. Play isn't always this enjoyable experience. And that can make it quite, especially when it comes to these familial relationships. So I was kind of looking at how we can understand family dynamics through people talking about play and board games and things like that. Yeah. And all of a sudden it can become quite a difficult thing to talk about, and it becomes incredibly personal. And so there's an element of, well, a lot of people won't want to talk about that, or a lot of people won't want to remember these negative experiences. And so potentially we end up with these really rose-tinted views of, oh, everyone, people might remember, oh, we argued that time when we played that game and bits like things like that. But generally people would be like, oh, we used to play this and we had a great time and so, but no one's going to remember, oh, I remember, some people remember this, people will be like, oh, I remember when my little brother cheated all the time and it was really annoying and, I really hated it at the time and things like that. And so it's important to remember these things, but it's also, it can be quite a lot to ask people to remember them at the same time.
Yeah, it is one of the reasons why, people, if I'm asking people about how they got into the hobby, you'll be amazed. They go, oh, well, I started off Monopoly, but usually the next phrase that they come out with, the next sentence they come out with is who they were playing that game with. And then that can take them on a kind of a bit of an emotional journey, which I'm more sometimes interested as an interviewer finding out the emotional impact of something over just the facts about something. You know, if somebody says, well, I played Monopoly, okay, but I also played Lost Valley of the Dinosaurs and played with my brother. All right, do you remember the dinosaurs had huge amounts of lipstick on them? Yes, I did, blah, blah, blah. We used to do this, blah, blah, blah. And it takes it and it kind of opens them up on the emotional side of things, which I'm more interested in. The whole reason I do this is because I'm interested in people, and if I can find to have an emotional discussion with them about something, it can peel back more about how they approach something than them just talking about the design ethos that they follow, or the structure that they follow, or the idea, or how they structure their day, or something like that, which is always kind of cool. Have you ever kind of, from a design, I know you write stuff for the Guardian. You've done actually talks and presentations in relation to board game history as well. Have you ever thought about kind of going into kind of like the design side of things, or, you know, reproducing some of the older games and saying, well, here, you know, let me do an updated version of this game just to show people how the mechanics would have worked and things like that?
No, I've definitely thought about it. I mean, I'm not a designer. I've never designed anything, so I've got these ideas in my head. I would probably be terrible at it in practice, but I think there's definitely, so one of the things I think games can be really great for is showing historical research. Yeah. Particularly if you're looking at things like processes, like economic, political, you know, all these processes I think work a lot better in a non-linear interactive fashion than they do in a big block of text, because a big block of text is just impenetrable to so many people. But games are a really good way of getting some stuff across. And I think about it quite a lot when I'm kind of looking at my research, and I'm like, well, I'm researching play and I'm researching players, and is there a way I can get my research across in a playful manner that makes, you know, so the content suits, you know, the kind of delivery suits the content kind of thing. Yeah. And I think it's definitely, I would love to work with more, you know, I've spoken with a few historians who are interested in using board games as a way to kind of show their research, and it's definitely something I'd love to see more of. It's actually becoming more over the last couple of years. I've seen it quite a bit, and that's really exciting to me. And so I'd love to get involved more with stuff like that. I think there's such a huge potential, and there's just all these amazing untapped kind of research avenues. And I think that people would be interested in, but are quite intimidating on their own. And a game is a really good way of getting this stuff across. I also think it's a really good way for historians to kind of, even if they don't use a game as their, you know, their dissertation or as a replacement for a paper, it's still a really good kind of thought experiment, I think, because you have to think about your research in an entirely different way. Yeah. And you have to kind of restructure it in your head. And so I think it's actually I'd love to see more historians kind of approaching their research from a more playful manner. Not playful in the sense of kind of, gonna be lighthearted and fun, but in the sense of kind of structuring things and, you know, creating a narrative and creating a flow and mechanics and all these things. I think there's a lot of value in that.
Yeah, and there seems to be more and more in terms of the commercial aspect of it. There seems to be a little bit more of kind of gamification of kind of like training and stuff like that, and using kind of almost elements from board games in order to teach people in kind of like a business environment. And there was a Kickstarter recently which was a playtesting journal, which was you could play essentially, you know, as you were going through your game testing, it would turn it almost into a game itself to kind of make the entire process kind of, I guess, fun, but also less strenuous as well. So people could take part in play testing and not feel that they were kind of, yes, they're giving all the figures and the information and the facts and stuff like that, but kind of almost making it easy because it was just something that became like a natural kind of flow for them. Do you think that in terms of the way that board games are going, that and I've seen this in the video game space, that we need kind of more critical writing in the board gaming space? You know, that we seem to be kind of at the beginning of where we are in terms of, you know, it's very popular. It's worth, hundreds of millions of dollars now, the board game industry. There's thousands of games coming out just you. But a lot of the kind of the journalism on it still seems to be very kind of, let's do some coverage on a game and not kind of maybe taking the next step yet.
Yeah, I think kind of getting, adding towards, so journalism isn't just kind of news and reviews, it's these kind of features and think pieces and critical analysis and things like that is really important. I think there's lots of great stuff happening in kind of game studies and this kind of the theoretical side. I'm pretty firmly based in history, but kind of taking, poaching bits from game studies, but it's fantastic seeing what people are doing. So I think that's important. But I think also, I think kind of bringing it to the journalism side is very important, especially, kind of reading stuff about kind of, so like colonial aspects of games and kind of rethinking, well, why are we, all this stuff is about dominance and what does that tell us about, the way we play and why we play and, we can't just blindly use these themes anymore. We really have to think about why we're using them, why they're used so much, and kind of analyze that a bit more. And I think that's really important because I think especially when it comes to things like colonialism, you really have to think a bit and you have to dig deep. And, and as a game designer, you can't just you don't just get to take these themes and these tropes and just kind of use them because they're there. You really have to take responsibility for the stuff you're creating and the themes that you use. And, you have to really think about, well, why am I using this, And I think that's a really important side of it.
Is there anybody that you kind of, that you regularly go to kind of read about or listen to or anything like that? Is there any kind of like podcasts or media that you kind of go to in order to kind of, that's helped you with your kind of your studies? If anybody's going to listen along tonight, and they said, "Oh, I'd like to take a couple of steps down that alley and into that street. How do I start my little journey down there?"
So there's a podcast called, oh god, this is where I'm going to get it wrong. It's a Game Study Buddies, I think. And yeah, so I've listened to a few of them, and they kind of take these kind of game studies study buddies. Sorry, there's an extra study in there. But yeah, they kind of do an episode, and they're quite long episodes. But they basically, it's two guys, and they're both academics, and they take these kind of big key texts in the area of game studies, and they just talk about them. They kind of go through them, they discuss them, for a bit, and it's very approachable. It's very interesting, especially, these kind of big texts can be quite intimidating, especially also it can cost a lot of money to even get access to this reading material. These books can be quite expensive, or if you don't have institutional access to libraries, things like that, it can be really difficult. So I think I think that's really great. It's a really good podcast. A lot of the time, I'm very lucky in that I know a few people who work in the area, and I often process a lot of stuff just by talking through it with my friends. Really, I've got friends, who are doing kind of more straight history PhDs, people who are more in game studies, people who are in kind of cultural analysis, and just kind of talking to people from these different backgrounds. I think one of the main things is to be really interdisciplinary, and I think it's a buzzword and it's kind of thrown around a lot now, especially in academic spaces. Everything is interdisciplinary, but actually, especially for something like board games, you really have to be, because there's not a literature in how we talk about players in like my own area in history, and so you have to kind of branch out into psychology and sociology, and then kind of game these kind of theories around games to make sense of it. And so I think no matter what your background is, or even if you're not necessarily an academic, there's a lot of different ways you can approach it, and you can like read kind of selected little bits and listen to stuff, and you kind of think, oh, that's interesting, and just kind of follow that through, and you'll think, okay, well, actually I quite like this psychological angle, and maybe I'll think of it in terms of that. And I think just kind of really broadening the places that you draw information from it's always great, especially when looking at games and play.
And the other thing that you also do, as well as you do freelance work, you do a fair bit of kind of writing on occasion as well. Is it mostly kind of video game stuff that you're doing? Are you doing kind of other stuff as well? Because I know that you write for the kind of, is it The Guardian? You do kind of regular stuff for.
So yeah, it's interesting. So it's mostly been video game stuff, but I've noticed the more I do my research, the more I'm kind of noticing these kind of longer themes. And so kind of one of the things I've been really lucky enough to do, because I've had a few editors who've been really great and supportive, is kind of taking my historical research and applying it to these kind of modern issues. So I talk a lot about political games and the idea of games being political. And I use my research when I talk about that and show that one of the ways that I kind of talk about, this idea of kind of publishers saying, oh no, this game isn't political, even though it's using all these clearly political themes, kind of pointing out how ridiculous this is, because as someone who spends all their time looking at games and archives, the idea of coming across a game that clearly has all these themes and thinking, oh, well, I can't look at it in that way because the publisher said so, is just so ludicrous. And the publisher even saying that in the first place is a massive political statement. Yeah. And they're actually putting everything in this context. Like, it just obviously shows how silly it is. Like, it's very silly. And so there's kind of all these kind of longer themes that I'm starting to notice that hopefully I'm going to get a bit more chance to write about.
So you're going to try and branch. I mean, if you were given the chance to kind of write more historical stuff, if The Guardian says, oh, just do an article on it, have a regular thing, talk about the kind of the past with it, would that be something you'd love to do, I guess? Are you not allowed to do it if you're doing a PhD? Are you still allowed, would you be allowed to do that?
So I would be. You have to be careful in how much of your research you put out there if you don't have it published in an academic journal or in a book or something like that, because basically if you're talking about your research and you don't have this bit of academic publishing already saying it, you've basically put out your research for free and people can take it, they can take bits of it, and they don't have to reference you because they have no academic reference to go to. So you have to be a bit careful in how much you put out there, which is frustrating because I've kind of had to say no to quite a few editors because I'm like, I'm really sorry, but I can't write about this right now because it's in my dissertation or it's part of my research and I can't put it out there until it's published. So it's really frustrating, especially kind of coming from the world of journalism, especially like games journalism, where it's such a quick turnaround. You write a piece and within a couple of days it's either online or it's going to the printers, or it's such a quick turnaround. And then going into academia, where it is the world's slowest, just like, you'll write something and then maybe 4 years later you might get a yes or a no as to whether they might publish it. And then there's like another year of peer review, maybe 2, and then just kind of these, so you can write something and then like 6 years later it'll like get published. And so it's very frustrating going from 2 very different worlds in terms of publishing. I
was going to say, it was interesting hearing you, one of the interviews that you had, kind of talking about scaling Notre Dame Cathedral, playing kind of like Assassin's Creed. And I was kind of like, oh. But then on the back of that, I believe that they were using some of the scans that they took to develop the game in order to potentially help with the rebuilding of the cathedral. So that's a bit weird. Also quick.
There's so much interesting stuff going on. I think especially games are a bit odd because a lot of games haven't grown up kind of needing this academic validation that a lot of mediums kind of seek. And so the kind of dialogue between academic institutions and kind of publishers or developers, it's often either not there or they kind of speak very different languages, or when consultants are brought on, they're brought on really late and they're brought on to basically be like, oh, well, what colour would that be, rather than part of the creative process. But there's definitely a growing, like, especially between like Ubisoft has put in a lot of effort into kind of harboring these really good relationships with institutions and doing all this extra stuff, which I think, there's obviously like there's marketing reasons for why you would do that. There's lots of reasons why you do that, but I think it is important. And I think it's great to have a bit more of this dialogue going on. It's just very encouraging as someone who writes about video games and someone who studies history, seeing any of this kind of dialogue going on is interesting. Yeah, I'm interested to see where it goes.
Yeah, not just making it up as they go along, but actually saying, let's look at the kind of the historical context of this, and let's actually look at if what we're presenting potentially to, let's face it, hundreds of thousands of people who have maybe no idea how that kind of place in history actually worked. That could be their first exposure to, say, the French Revolution, or or ancient Greece, or and that kind of thing. So it's kind of important to kind of get that, that if you're doing it as part of a narrative, as part of a story, or actually saying this is how things could have played out, that you try and make things kind of as factually correct, or as much as you can, basically.
Yeah, I think just kind of just having a dialogue with historians is helpful, because I'm a big believer in that historical accuracy is not necessary. And I really hate the term historical accuracy, because it just brings up a lot of stuff. Well, you're accurate to which histories, and, and where do you draw the line in accuracy? And there's all that complicated stuff. But I think having a dialogue with experts and people who research stuff is just, and also kind of research is itself a creative process. And so I think kind of bringing research into that creative process, I think you can tell when a game has really done its homework, and when it's kind of had this kind of research going from the very beginning, rather than just kind of like ticking off boxes at the end. You can really tell, and I think it's very important.
Yeah, no, it's good. If people have listened along tonight and they want to get, I guess, kind of gaze on your works as a historical expert, where do you exist on the interweb nets? Where can we find you, Holly?
I mean, it's mainly Twitter, probably, which is because now I'm just thinking like, oh God, what rubbish have I tweeted recently? And I'm telling people to go have a look.
Exactly. They'll be going expecting, let's look at this, and it's like, oh, okay.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, that's not exactly what's, but okay. So it's mainly Twitter at the moment, because unfortunately I can't share a lot of. I mean, I talk about my research a bit on Twitter, but there will be I have a chapter coming out in a book called Homo Ludens, published by Routledge, and it should be coming out this year, but it's academic publishing, so who knows? But it should be this year anyway, and that's on I'm trying to. It's quite a long-winded title. My chapter. I think it's like the nursery. The British Empire will be built from nursery floors. Depictions of travel and space in 19th century British board games. I think I've got that right.
Oh, there you go.
It's basically looking at geographical games from the 19th century and looking at ones that talk about empire and ones that talk about Europe and the kind of differences and similarities between the two.
Excellent.
Yeah. So hopefully keep an eye out.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much for coming on. This has been fascinating.
Well, thank you for asking me. I hope it's been enjoyable.
Well, it has. If people want to keep an eye on what we're up to, go to the internet web, search for We're Not Wizards. You'll find us on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and we've got a website which is we'renotwizards.com. We've got a blog which is we'renotwizards.blogspot.com. You can email us, which is magic@we'renotwizards. I am aware of the irony of the email address. That's why I chose it. If you like what you've listened to tonight, there's a couple of things you can do. Tell somebody else, basically. Or the other thing you can do is you can go on to these podcast catchers, which have either got the name Pod or Cast, except if you're Spotify, and drop us a little rating or a review. If you like us an awful lot, go to Apple Podcasts and drop us a rating or a review or a subscription there. And as we always say, if you are going to be giving us a rating or a review, don't give us 10 stars because it makes us big-headed. But don't give us 1 star because it makes us cry. Give us something in the middle, like a 5, because it's in the middle, it's average, and we're just a little bit average. But the person who's not been average, they're rather wonderful, rather fantastic, Holly Nielsen. Thank you, very much. There's only 2 more things to do. The first thing is to remember that we're many things, but we're not wizards. Are we wizards, Holly?
No.
Absolutely not. Not a chance. You know, let's finish on a high. And the second thing is to say goodbye. So it's a goodbye from Holly. Say goodbye, Holly.
Goodbye.
And it's a goodbye from me. Remember, stay safe, roll sixes, make something awful. And you think, board games go back for ages, for a long, long time, and it's not just about Catan and Monopoly. It's, it's Ugg and Tharg chucking rocks at each other over a little kind of stone tablet board type thing stuff. But until the next time, goodbye.
A wizard is never late. Nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to.